Hi, Paul here from Photo Genius. In this video I want to show you how to take really cool nighttime photos. This video is aimed at the beginner, so we're going to be talking you through the gear, talking you through what camera modes to use, the settings, everything you need to get you started. It's going to be a lot of fun. And this evening we're at a place called Kangaroo Point, which is on the Brisbane River, just around sunset. Great spot, gives us a great vantage point of the city. We're going to try and visit 2 locations in this video. It's going to be a lot of fun, so stick around. Now, my intentions for this video were to do something a bit different. Instead of shooting in the studio, I wanted to take you guys on location, do some cool nighttime photography and share with you how I did it and what settings I used and so on. But it was actually a lot trickier than I thought. Not from a photography point of view. Taking photos at nighttime is relatively easy, and I'm going to show you how to do it shortly. But taking video in low light is actually really tricky. And the light was terrible. No matter where I went, the light was awful. And really, I didn't feel like I was going to be able to deliver a video that was really the quality that you guys would expect of this channel. So hence, 2 days later, I'm now here in the studio to talk you through all the key essentials. I was shooting with the Nikon D3500. I was also shooting with the Nikon Z6. And look, I've got an image behind me here. This image turned out really great. I think this was taken on the evening, and this was taken not with the Z6, this was taken with the Nikon D3500, which goes to show that you can take cool nighttime photos even with an entry-level camera. And again, this is something that I often say on this channel. It's not about the gear so much, it's about what you do with it and how you use it. So if you're new to the channel and you want to know how to take great photos, please consider subscribing. Right, let's start by talking about the gear. Now, if you want to do good nighttime photos, you're going to need to be able to get out of auto and use your camera manually. So a DSLR, mirrorless or bridge camera should allow you to do this. Once you've got the camera sorted, you're then going to need something to keep the camera steady whilst you're taking your shot. And this is where a tripod comes in. A tripod is an essential bit of kit if you're going to do low light and nighttime photography. Now, I'm going to recommend 3 tripods to you, and details and links to these will be found in the description below the video, so check these out. First one is one of my all-time favorites, which is the Manfrotto Pixie Evo, a very small, lightweight, compact tripod that you can use just about anywhere. It is very small, but it's pretty cheap and it's very sturdy and well made. The next one, you may have seen these before, Joby GorillaPod. This is quite a big one. You can get smaller ones. These are the ones that have the flexible legs. This is good if you're working on uneven surfaces, but you can also wrap the legs around maybe a fence post, or some people hang or suspend cameras from trees. They're pretty cool. So that's the Joby GorillaPod. And my next recommendation, which is a really good, almost full-size tripod, but is great for traveling, is the Manfrotto B3 travel tripod. Here it is, it's packed down, so it's pretty small. I did a video on this, I'll put a description up here so you can check this out. So there's 3 tripod recommendations. And again, for more details on those, just look below the video, you'll find links and information relating to those. The next thing you're going to need is a remote. This is a Canon remote that will work on most Canon DSLRs. This is a Nikon remote. Some of you may be lucky enough to have a camera that allows you to connect to your smartphone, and therefore you can use that as a remote. Some of you may not have a remote, and if this is you, I've got a really cool trick that I actually used on the night myself. And this is a way of getting around not having a remote, and I'll come back to that later on in the video. Right, now let's talk camera modes and settings. Now, if you've ever tried taking photos in low light or at night time with a camera set in the auto mode, then there's every chance that your photos have turned out a bit disappointing. And this usually comes down to 2 reasons, 2 things that in auto you have no control over. Number 1, the flash pops up. Usually when you're using your camera in auto, in low light, the flash pops up. I get it, I understand why the camera does this. It's trying to throw some extra light on the subject, which kind of makes sense. But look at the image behind me. That little pop-up flash is going to do nothing to illuminate that scene, and therefore it's a complete waste of time. The second thing the camera will do is almost certainly increase the ISO. Now again, I understand why. Increasing the ISO is going to make your image brighter, but increasing the ISO also means the image quality deteriorates. It will look grainy. This is called digital noise, and it's something where possible we want to try and avoid. A more effective way of taking a photo in low light is to get out of auto, get into the manual mode and start taking control of the camera's shutter. Now the shutter sits inside the camera. It's a bit like a door. When you press the shutter button, it opens, allowing light to enter the camera, and then it closes. And that's it. You then get to see your photo. Now, once the shutter opens, your camera is recording light. And of course, the longer it's open, the more light the camera can record and the brighter the image will be. So the most effective way of taking photos in low light is to slow the shutter down. This is also often referred to as a long exposure. So how do you control the shutter? Well, there's a number of camera modes that will allow you to do this, but in this video we're going to look at one in particular. This is called shutter priority. This is a really good mode if you're a beginner, but interestingly is also the mode that is often used by professional sports photographers. The great thing about this mode is you can control the shutter speed and the camera looks after the aperture. It's a great mode. So to select this on your camera, look to the camera dial for an S. So on most cameras, you rotate the dial to get to the S, which is for shutter priority. If you've got a Canon camera, you'll notice there's no S. Look out for TV. This is time value. Now, whilst it's a different name, it's still shutter priority. So once you're in the shutter priority mode, all you've got to do to change the shutter speed is turn the dial on the camera. On the Canon cameras, it's usually found on the top. On this Nikon, it's at the back here. Now, if I wake up the camera and I start dialing to the right, I see the shutter speed changing or increasing. Now I'm going to take it as far as it goes. On this particular model, the D3500, the fastest shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second. I'll put that here. Now, if you've got a camera that's maybe higher up in the range or more expensive, then you may be lucky enough to have a top shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. I'll pop that here. Now, these shutter speeds are really fast. So if you're shooting in really good light during the daytime, these shutter speeds can be ideal. The shutter will open and close really, really quickly. But taking photos at nighttime, of course, because there's less light, we want to slow the shutter down. We want the shutter to be open longer so we get more opportunity to record the light. So this is done by dialing to the left. Now, as I dial to the left, the shutter speed is slowing down, and there's a load of shutter speeds to choose from. Thousandths, hundreds, tenths of a second. Now I'm going to stop at 10. So this is 1/10. This is 1/10th of a second, because I want to take a picture and I want you to hear this. Now what you hear there is 2 clicks. The first click is the shutter opening. The second click is the shutter closing. So we are already getting down to a slower shutter speed. Now, if I keep dialing down, eventually I will see that the number now is shown as a number with what looks like a quotation mark behind it. Here, I have a shutter speed of 1 second. Again, I'll take another picture. Now that was a second gap between the shutter opening and closing. And if I keep dialing to the left, we start to get into the really slow shutter speeds. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, all the way down to 30 seconds. These are the sorts of shutter speeds that will allow you to take amazing photos at nighttime. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the great thing about using shutter priority is that we don't have to worry too much about the aperture, because the camera's adjusting the aperture depending on what shutter speed we select. So should we even care about aperture when using this mode? Yes, we should. And that's because sometimes the camera will not be able to choose an aperture that will give us a balanced exposure. And you'll easily spot this because the F number on the screen on the back of your camera will begin to flash. And if this happens, all you need to do is make a change to your shutter speed. This may mean increasing or decreasing the shutter speed until the point that the F number stops flashing. Now I want to quickly talk about ISO. ISO is a function of your camera that will affect your exposure. Increase your ISO for a brighter image, decrease it for a darker image. Now one thing to avoid here is automatic ISO, because your camera takes control and you don't know what it's doing. If your camera chooses a higher ISO, whilst it might make your image brighter, your picture will suffer from digital noise. It will start to look grainy. I mentioned it earlier in the video. So default ISO for me is 200, but when taking photos at night time, I drop the ISO even lower. On a Canon camera, you'll usually find an ISO button on the back or the top of the camera. Press it, dial in the lowest ISO possible when you're doing nighttime photography. Now, if you've got a Nikon camera and you haven't got an ISO button like the one on the top of the Z6, look for a button that is marked with an I. The I button allows you then to navigate to the ISO and you can change it. Get off auto, drop it to the lowest. Again, with this camera, it's 100. ISO, keep it low. Now I want to go back to remotes. I did mention them earlier in the video. If you're doing a 5, 10, 20 second exposure, you do not want your camera to move at all. Using a remote means that you can activate the camera's shutter without actually touching the camera. But I do appreciate that some of you may not have a remote, so I promised you a little trick. You can set up a self timer in your camera. That means that after you press the shutter button, the camera will count down and then take the photo. This is a great way of eliminating camera shake for free. Now on most cameras you'll find a button which has what looks like a little clock symbol next to it. If you press this button and select the timer, you will now see a delay. If I press the shutter button, that's the timer, that's the shutter opening and closing. Self timer is a really cool tip and it's free. Now in a moment we're going to take a look at some of the images that I captured a couple of nights ago with these very cameras, but before we do, let's run through a checklist that can help you take amazing photos at night. The first one being fairly obvious: use a solid tripod so your camera can't move. Number 2, select shutter priority mode, because you want to be able to control the shutter, but you don't want to have to worry about the aperture too much. Number 3, ISO, keep it low. Dial in 100 ISO. Number 4, choose a shutter speed. Maybe start with 5 or 10 seconds and then play around and experiment and see how different shutter speeds maybe affect the look of your image. Number 5, if you haven't got a remote, find your camera's self timer. It's a freebie, it's already built in, and it's another way of avoiding shake. Okay, let's take a look at those images. This first image is taken with the Nikon D3500, and I keep raving about this camera because for an entry-level camera you can take amazing photos like this. 10-second exposure, ISO low, camera chose f8 for the aperture. This second image is taken with the Z6 Nikon mirrorless camera. 30-second exposure gives a nice blur and softness to the Brisbane River. For my second location, I went to the Story Bridge, which is often illuminated in different colours. On this evening, it was a beautiful purple colour. This is taken with the D3500 once again, 20-second exposure. And when you see this image on a big screen, it's amazing how the camera's picked up the stars in the sky, which is quite unusual when you're in the middle of the city. A second image of the Story Bridge, this time taken with the Z6. I think definitely a better picture, this one, bit sharper, and definitely the Z6 had a better job at rendering the colours. This image was taken the following evening with the Z6 down at Manly Harbour, which is close to the Photo Genius office. Exposure time here is just 0.8 seconds, shot with a really wide aperture f2.8 and a higher ISO to get the stars in the sky. And finally, another visit to the Story Bridge, this time for a pano shot with the Z6. This is 6 images stitched together. Exposure time 13 seconds, f6.3, ISO 100. Now, if you do follow my tips and you get some amazing nighttime photos, I would really like to see them. So if you're posting your images to Instagram, make sure you include the hashtag PhotoGeniusBrisbane. That way I can search and find your images. Now, if you've enjoyed the video and you've enjoyed the tips, please give us a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget you can leave your questions, comments and suggestions below, where you will also find details about the tripods I mentioned earlier in the video. I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Goodbye.